In the book, you write, words can hardly capture the U.S. response to the Syrian refugee crisis. I would love you to talk a bit more about that.
The Syrian refugee crisis is a real horror story. Syria's collapsing into self-destruction. Millions of people are fleeing the disaster. And we have had a role in it, not the entire role, but some. So, for example, ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, is an outgrowth, one of the horrible outgrowths of the U.S. Sledgehammer that smashed up Iraq, that ignited, among other atrocities, it ignited a sectarian conflict that hadn't existed before, which is now tearing the region apart. If you look at the U.S. allies like Turkey, they're contributing massively to the crisis by attacking the one ground force that's the Kurds, who are actually not only defending their own territory and constructing a remarkably decent society in the context of this horror, but are also fighting the ISIS forces. Their Iraqi associates are on the U.S. terrorist list. Turkey's attacking them. Other U.S. allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, are supporting, as Turkey is supporting other groups which even the West regards as terrorist groups, the al-Nusra Front. Anyhow, we have a role. How many Syrian refugees are we accepting? Basically none. And those few have to go through a long vetting process to make sure that nobody is an Islamic terrorist pretending to be a doctor. And the fear, and the United States is probably the safest country in the world. It's also the most frightened country in the world. It's just a shocking matter. And simply with regard to the Syrians, the words don't capture it. With regard to Central America and Mexico, it's even worse. There, our role in creating the situation from which people are fleeing was decisive. Just a couple of weeks ago, the local newspaper, Boston Globe, had a good story to their credit on one of the many deportations that the Obama administration is carrying out. They have a record so far, Obama, in deporting people. Now, this happened to be a man who'd been living here for decades, a Guatemalan, had a family, business, no problems. Immigration Service pounced on him, sent him out of the country. Where was he from? He was fleeing from the areas, the Mayan areas, where virtual genocide had been carried out with the strong support of the Reagan administration. So he's fleeing from our virtual genocidal activities. He's made a life for himself, so Obama picks him up and sends him back to, breaks up his family, sends him back to a situation where he can barely survive. The plurality of the peak of what was called the refugee crisis, most of the refugees were coming from Honduras. Why Honduras? Well, it's a very poor country, a horrible history, which we have a good role in. In 2009, it was beginning to escape. It had a reformist president who was proposing some mild reforms which would have been very helpful to the population. He was thrown out by a military coup. The coup organized an election which practically nobody paid any attention to except the United States. The Obama administration legitimated, they had some critical words, but they effectively legitimated the coup, which they refused to call a coup, so that they could continue to send arms, and the election. The consequence was that Honduras, which was already in pretty horrible conditions, became a major horror story, the worst violence in the hemisphere, maybe in the world. People started fleeing. So what do? We send them back. We ask Mexico to prevent them from coming to our borders, which incidentally is just what the European Union is doing with Turkey. Get Turkey to keep them away from us. We cause the problems. Somebody else has to solve them. We don't solve them. In fact, if you look around the world, there are countries that generate refugees. We're the peak, probably. There are countries that accept refugees, like, say, Lebanon, poor country with a quarter of the population of Syrian refugees. That's on top of other refugee flows from Palestine, from Iraq, for which we bear plenty of responsibility. And then there are countries that generate refugees and refuse to take them in, like us. In fact, you could say the same about Europe. Europe is consumed with a refugee crisis, including refugees fleeing from Africa. There's a couple of centuries of history relating Europe from Africa, and Africa. I don't have to review it. But now we can't handle these refugees. And it's in the United States, it's grotesque, but it's not that. In Europe, it is too. In fact, the violence against immigrants in Europe is much beyond what it is here. People burning down houses, neo-Nazi groups developing. It's grotesque. And you look at the numbers. There are two countries that are at the peak of having done something: Sweden and Germany. Sweden is a country of about 8 million people. It has 40,000 refugees, half of 1% of the population. So it's groaning under a hopeless crisis. As I said, Lebanon, quarter poor country, 25% of its population are refugees from Syria. Jordan's similar. Germany did at first absorb refugees up to maybe 1 million. It's a country of over 80 million people, a very rich country, not a very pretty historical record, which I don't have to go through, but can't handle it. Belgium has actually the worst record in Africa, even worse than the other European countries. And it's not ancient history. The Belgian Congo, former Belgian Congo, which ought to be one of the richest areas in the world and the leader in African revival, did achieve independence in 1960 with a very promising young leader, one of the most promising in Africa, Patrice Lumumba. The CIA was ordered to kill him, but the Belgians got there first, and they didn't take any chances. His body was cut up into pieces and dissolved in sulfuric acid. You don't do things like ISIS. The U.S., Belgium, other Western countries immediately supported a murderous kleptomaniac, Mobutu, horrible dictator who ruined the country. Right now, the worst atrocities in the world are being carried out in the Congo. Partly U.S. ally Rwanda is involved, partly it's militias trying to steal the rich mineral resources with multinationals looking over their shoulders so that we can get the minerals that are used in everybody's iPhone and other high-tech devices. Millions of people have been killed, every possible horror story. But Belgium is groaning under the crisis, the refugee crisis, like the rest of us. The whole picture is just, again, I don't think you can find words to describe it.